The Arizona sun hung high like a burning brand, turning the horizon into molten gold. The land stretched endlessly, broken only by dry mesas and twisted sagebrush. Luke Harrington rode alone, his horse weary, his canteen half empty. For years he had wandered the frontier, trying to forget a past that refused to die. The screams of a burned homestead, the graves he left behind. The silence of the desert was his punishment and his salvation both. But on that day in 1874, even the silence seemed uneasy, as if the land itself held its breath. Dust swirled around his boots as he reined in at a narrow ridge. Something below caught his eye, a flicker of color against the pale sand. At first, he thought it was a mirage. Then he saw them, 4 figures lying near the dried creek bed, motionless under the relentless sun. His heart thudded. They were women, Apache by their braids and torn buckskin dresses, bound to wooden stakes, wrists and ankles raw. Even from a distance, Luke could see their suffering. Someone had left them there to die slow, thirsty deaths. He dismounted slowly, torn between fear and conscience. The army patrols were never far, and helping Apache prisoners meant trouble, the kind that ended with a rope around the neck. But as he stood there, watching the faint rise and fall of one woman's chest, his hesitation cracked. No man with a soul could leave them there. Luke swallowed hard, tossed his hat aside, and rushed down the ridge. His boots sank into the hot sand as he reached the first woman. Her skin was blistered, lips cracked, breath shallow. He whispered, "Easy now. You're safe." The rawhide bindings bit into his hands as he cut through them with his hunting knife. One by one he freed the women, dragging them to the narrow shadow of a boulder. They were too weak to speak, their eyes dazed with pain and thirst. Luke took the last of his water and tilted it carefully against each woman's lips. The liquid barely wet their tongues, but it was enough to keep life flickering. Sweat stung his eyes and his own throat burned, but he didn't stop until all 4 breathed steady again. When he turned to the last of them, he froze. She was younger than the rest, no more than 20. Her face, though sun-scorched, still carried the strength of someone who refused to die quietly. Her dark eyes fluttered open, locking with his. In that instant, Luke felt something shift. It wasn't gratitude or fear, it was defiance, a fire that lived even in suffering. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked like dry twigs. "Aiyana," she whispered, naming herself before darkness claimed her again. The name lingered in his mind like an echo. By dusk, the desert cooled, and Luke had built a small fire near a sheltered bluff. He fed the women sips of broth, torn from his own rations, and covered them with his coat. The flames cast a dim orange glow on their faces, chasing away the night's chill. He didn't know who had done this, soldiers, bounty hunters, or rivals, but he knew cruelty when he saw it. Somewhere deep inside, an old memory stirred, his wife's face pale in the light of a burning cabin. That pain long buried came rushing back with every heartbeat. The night stretched long and silent. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries mingling with the crackle of the fire. Luke sat awake, rifle resting across his knees, keeping watch. The stars above looked like eyes of the dead, cold, unblinking. He had spent years running from ghosts, but tonight, surrounded by strangers and danger, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Saving them wouldn't bring back what he lost, but maybe it would mean something. Maybe mercy still had a place in a world that had forgotten it. Before dawn, the women stirred, muttering softly in Apache. Only one voice spoke clear enough for him to understand. Aiyana's. She tried to sit up but winced, clutching her arm. Luke gently pressed her shoulder. "Rest," he said. "You're safe." She blinked at him with wary eyes, uncertain if she should believe. He offered her a small tin cup of water. For a moment she hesitated, then accepted. Their fingers brushed, and Luke noticed how rough and scarred her hands were, yet delicate, shaped by both hardship and grace. When morning light spilled across the sand, Luke looked over the women he had rescued. 2 were strong enough to walk. 1 still slept. Aiyana was different. She studied him with a quiet curiosity. Her gaze carried a mix of suspicion and gratitude that words couldn't express. Luke felt it too, an invisible bridge forming between two worlds that had always been at war. He said little as he packed his gear, but he couldn't stop glancing at her. Something about her silence spoke louder than any words could. They traveled slowly toward his small homestead, a lonely cabin tucked in the shadow of the red cliffs. The women rode weakly, their bodies still recovering, while Luke led the horse on foot. The journey was long, marked by heat and dust, but the thought of leaving them behind never crossed his mind. When they reached the cabin, he helped them inside, set out blankets, and built another fire. The simple act of caring for them, feeding, tending, protecting, filled a hollow in his heart he hadn't realized was still open. That night, as the canyon winds whispered outside, Luke sat near the doorway, cleaning his revolver. Aiyana watched from the corner, her dark hair catching the firelight. "Why help us?" she asked softly, her English broken but clear enough. Luke hesitated. "Because no one else would." She looked at him a long time, then nodded slowly, as if trying to understand a world that could still hold kindness. Neither spoke again, but when the fire burned low, Luke saw her eyes close in peace, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace himself. When sleep finally claimed him, the last thing Luke heard was the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of the women he had saved. The desert, once silent and cruel, now held the soft hum of life. Outside, the coyotes grew quiet. The stars watched from above, as if bearing witness to a moment of grace hidden deep in the wild frontier. Luke didn't know what tomorrow would bring, danger, vengeance, or perhaps something entirely different, but he knew one truth now. He had saved 4 lives that night, and one of them had already begun to save his. The days stretched long and golden beneath the Arizona sun. The land that once seemed empty now breathed with quiet life. Luke's camp, hidden deep within a canyon few dared to enter, had become a sanctuary. The 4 women he had rescued began to heal. Their laughter, faint at first, slowly returned like water finding its course after a long drought. Luke watched them regain strength, teaching them how to use his tools, sharing what food he had. But even as he helped them mend, he knew it could not last. The frontier never let peace linger for long. Weeks passed before the first of the women left. They walked away one dawn, wrapped in borrowed blankets, leaving soft footprints in the sand that vanished by noon. Luke stood at the edge of the canyon, watching them disappear into the horizon. Only Aiyana remained. She said little, but her presence filled the cabin more than any words could. "I owe you my life," she said one evening, her voice gentle yet unshakable. "I will help you rebuild yours." Luke had no answer then, but her words settled in his chest like a promise. They fell into a rhythm shaped by the desert itself. Each morning, Aiyana rose before dawn, fetching water from the spring, while Luke tended to the horses. They hunted together, shared quiet meals by the fire, and worked side by side repairing the broken walls of his old cabin. Sometimes she hummed soft Apache songs, melodies that drifted like ghosts through the canyon. Luke didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling, sorrow and hope entwined. In her silence, he found comfort. In her eyes, he found forgiveness for things he'd never spoken aloud. At first, their words were few. She spoke only fragments of English, and he knew no Apache. But gestures, laughter, and patience became their shared tongue. When he split wood, she mimicked the swing of his axe. When she cooked, he tried to follow her ways, burning more than he saved. They laughed then, real laughter, sharp and unexpected, the kind that chipped away at walls built by years of loneliness. It wasn't the kind of love Luke had known before, fragile and fleeting, but something older, rooted deep like the canyon rock itself. Yet even paradise has its shadows. Travelers came rarely, but news traveled fast across the wild country. One afternoon, while trading at a distant outpost, Luke overheard 2 men talking, bounty hunters. They spoke of Apache escapees, of rewards, and of a white man rumored to be hiding them in the southern canyons. The words froze Luke's blood. He left the supplies behind and rode home fast, dust stinging his eyes. When he reached his cabin, Aiyana was waiting, her bow in hand, sensing the danger he had yet to speak. "They're coming," he said simply. She nodded. That night, they fortified the cabin as best they could. Luke loaded his rifle and checked every bullet. Aiyana moved quietly beside him, tying the horses farther down the canyon, scattering their tracks with brush. Neither spoke of fear, though both felt it pressing heavy in the cool desert air. The moon rose, casting long silver lines across the sand. Luke watched Aiyana sitting by the firelight, her face half in shadow. He realized he could not bear the thought of losing her. Not now. Not after she had brought life back into his world of ghosts. By dawn, the sound of hooves shattered the silence. 5 riders, rough men with hard eyes and easy cruelty, appeared at the mouth of the canyon. "Luke Harrington," one called out. "You're harboring Apache prisoners. Step aside and hand the woman over." Luke stepped out from behind the door, rifle raised, his boots firm in the dust. "No one here's a prisoner," he said coldly. The leader spat, grinning. "That's so? Then you'll die with her." The air went still, then exploded with gunfire. Echoes roared through the canyon like thunder. Smoke and dust filled the air. Bullets tore through the wooden posts, splinters flying. Luke ducked low, firing from cover, counting each shot. 2 men fell. Aiyana loosed arrows from the shadows, swift and silent, her movements like the wind. But there were too many. Luke felt the sear of lead graze his shoulder, then another slammed into his side. He stumbled, pain blooming white-hot. Aiyana cried out, rushing to him, but he pushed her back, reloading with trembling hands. "Stay down," he rasped. The fight dragged on until, at last, the canyon fell quiet again, broken only by the whine of wind through stone. When the smoke cleared, 3 bodies lay still in the dust. The others fled, wounded and terrified. Aiyana dropped to her knees beside Luke, pressing her hands against his bleeding side. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. "Why risk everything for me?" she whispered, voice breaking. Luke tried to smile, but the effort cost him. "Because some things," he said softly, "are worth dying for." His eyes met hers, full of the same fire he had seen the first day, the fire that refused to die. The desert seemed to hold its breath again, waiting. Aiyana worked through the night, tending his wounds with herbs and fire-warmed water. Her hands never shook. She whispered prayers between sobs, begging the spirits to spare him. Luke drifted in and out of sleep, haunted by memories, his wife's face, his failures, the loneliness that had consumed him. But every time he opened his eyes, Aiyana was there. She sang to him in her own tongue, low and trembling, a song that wove life into the darkness. He realized then that she was no longer someone he had saved. She was the one saving him now. By morning his breathing steadied. The worst had passed. When Luke finally opened his eyes fully, Aiyana sat beside him, head resting against his arm. Outside, the desert stretched wide and quiet, painted gold by the rising sun. "You stayed," he murmured. She looked up, smiling faintly. "I told you," she said, her accent soft but sure. "I will help you rebuild your life." He reached for her hand, rough meeting soft, 2 worlds touching without fear. No vows were spoken, none were needed. The bond between them was older than words, born from mercy, forged by fire. As weeks turned into months, their scars healed, though the world beyond the canyon still burned with hatred. Travelers whispered stories of a white man and an Apache woman living alone among the cliffs, bound by something the frontier could not understand. Some called it sin, others called it legend. But Luke and Aiyana never cared for names. They built, they hunted, they laughed. When storms rolled across the desert, they faced them together. And each evening, as the sun bled red over the mesas, she would sit beside him, the woman he had once saved and who had saved him in return.